All right.
Yeah, and so just as a quick little reminder, we will have the chat and the Q&A open for this session. And both of those are open to folks, and I will be monitoring them, but as much as possible, wherever you would like to, you're also welcome, of course, to do so on an ongoing basis, and otherwise I'll just be taking care of it and we'll go from there.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, if you can monitor the chat, because yeah, when you're speaking, sometimes it's I find the flow is bad if I'm like, oh, something's in chat, and sometimes it's just like, I agree. And you're like, all right.
Yeah, totally agree. We have Cheryl who's attending right now. Cheryl, you're our only attendee, so hi. Hope you're doing well. But we will be, so we're just going to keep this up for a few minutes. We'll start just shortly after 11 to make sure that folks can join. And in that time, Paul, if you need to do anything else to prep yourself, you are set and ready to go.
Yeah, I'm set. Good morning, Cheryl. Oh, I just put that. Thanks for joining so far. For some of the people that did, if you want to add into the chat the organizations you're from, the positions you have within that, that'd be great to know, and maybe I can throw in some examples that relate to your work.
Yeah, good morning, folks. We're going to wait a few minutes just to ensure that all who are able to join are hopefully able to, as we start. Feel free to, as Paul said, introduce yourself in the chat. We do have a smaller group of attendees, so as we go through, we will have opportunities for questions. And so as active as you would like to be in the chat, please feel free to do so. We would love your participation throughout the webinar. And we'll get started probably at about 11:03 or shortly thereafter. Good morning for the folks who have just joined. We're just holding off for another minute or so as we let those who had meetings right up until 11 jump off of that and jump onto this. So we'll get started in just a minute or two. And if anybody has any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat in advance. And otherwise, feel free to introduce yourself with your name and your organization and your title if you would like any specific kind of examples to be brought up from Paul during the webinar as well.
Good to see a few multi-service organizations. Definitely, this can be applicable to organizations doing that kind of work.
Awesome. All right, folks, we are going to get started. We will just be doing a little bit of an introduction, a welcome at first, and then you won't see me anymore. We'll let Paul take the stage. So thank you all for joining. This webinar is being recorded, as we will be sharing the recording with those who could not attend or who would be interested otherwise. And we will be sharing the slides afterwards, as well as a feedback survey that we would love your participation in. With that being said, if you have any questions, we do have the opportunity to, you are able to raise your hand if you would like the ability to actually speak and speak to a question, or you are welcome to put them in the chat or the Q&A, whichever you would prefer. And if you have any tech questions, we will speak specifically to that now. There is closed captioning available for today. Please feel free to click CC at the bottom for the live transcript and closed captioning settings and adjust based on your needs and your preference. You can change the size, for example, and also just hide the subtitles, just so you are aware and reassured. Hiding the subtitles does not mean that they are hidden for anybody else, so it is to your personal needs. And if you have any technical questions throughout the webinar, please use the chat, message me directly. I will take care of anything as much as possible, of course. Not a tech wizard. And on that note, welcome to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be speaking with, or Paul Baker will be speaking to the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework and Principles-Based Evaluation. And as part of the ConnectED program, if you have any thoughts or ideas in advance or at the end, you are always welcome to contact me. My name is Kirsten, my pronouns are she and her, and I would be happy to help with anything as we go through. Before we move on to welcoming Paul and having his expertise shared with us, it's important that we start these kinds of group setting meetings and events with a territorial land acknowledgement. And so United Way, Halton and Hamilton, though we are currently virtual, we work in the communities that are situated on the lands of many Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future. And so we recognize and thank the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Haudenosaunee for their stewardship of the land and for sharing with us through the Dish with One Spoon Covenant. We know that this covenant and the treaties that govern this land have been violated by settlers over the past 200 years, and we pledge to learn, reflect, and act in reconciliation and solidarity with Indigenous community members. When I conduct a land acknowledgement, I find it important to reflect on what that means. And incorporating these into our events and work is inspired by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. And so it is important to recognize land acknowledgements as a stepping stone to the involved work that is required for justice and relationship building with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. Today, we are here virtually to speak about how we can improve our communities in a way that is focused on growth from a holistic and asset-based perspective. We're incredibly privileged to have the access to technology that we have that enables this conversation, and to have a seat at decision-making tables of any kind around how we can support and grow our communities. I feel very lucky personally to be able to be a part of that. And with that in mind, I would like to use this time to call and commit to recognition of treaties and sovereignty of Indigenous communities when we are doing this work, and to also recommit to authentic community engagement with all of our neighbors and partners. This is not always comfortable or the simplest or shortest amount of time sort of work to include in our current structures, but those structures need to shift in order to be truly equitable for all and follow the admirable spirit of looking 7 generations into the future to plan and act for our communities from an Indigenous way of knowing. We have also and will continue to be donating and making contributions to support local Indigenous groups, and we encourage others to do the same. At this time, we will be making a donation to the Mohawk Village Memorial Park on Six Nations territory, which is a planned space for honoring, remembering, and gathering for the residential school survivors of the Mohawk Institute or the Mush Hole. I will put the link in the chat for anyone who would like more information on that project specifically, and you're welcome to get in touch with me during or after the presentation if you would like more information or have any questions. And with that, I also wanted to share this image. It is from the Coming Home to Indigenous Community, or Coming Home to Indigenous Lands, I believe, which is a very, very comprehensive map that was created by the University of Maine that speaks to and shows the different Indigenous names of different areas within the the structures and societies and communities that we currently know as something different. And so I wanted to share that here. I will share some of those resources in the chat. And of course, I always encourage folks to visit native-land.ca to learn more about the territories on which you live if you are not aware. Thanks. And with that, an introduction and thank you to our facilitator, Paul Baker. Paul Baker is I apologize, my notes have gone away, but Paul Baker is an amazing partner of ours within the ConnectED program currently, and within the past 2 years at this point, I believe, the Social Impact Squared organization, of which Paul is the founder and lead consultant of, has been conducting incredible supports of one-on-one evaluation support for agencies within our network. And so we are incredibly lucky and grateful for our ongoing partnership and for Paul's specific work within asset-based and holistic evaluation frameworks and supports, specifically today with regards to the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework and Principles-Based Evaluation. Paul, if you would like to introduce yourself further, you are welcome to, but other than that, I will let you take over the floor.
Great. I think you just need to stop share so I can share. Thank you. Am I sharing now? No. So where did this go? There we go. Share. Okay, so I should be sharing it now. Yes, great. All right, well, thank you for that introduction, Kirsten. I am excited to present this framework to the attendees today. I found it a very valuable framework for the work that I have done, and we'll be using some examples throughout this presentation of work that I've done here with some youth employment programs in Hamilton. But certainly this is a framework that is being used more broadly. And there's an organization, Sustainable Livelihoods Canada, that is in the process of being created to support community of practice of people using this framework across Canada. So there's me. Kristen has done a fairly good job at introducing myself, and we're tight on time, so I won't go into more details. But you're welcome to visit Social Impact Squared. There, you can sign up for the newsletter there to stay in touch and hear more updates and resources as I share them along the way. So our main purpose today is to introduce the Sustainable Livelihoods framework. And to start, livelihoods part of the framework is a really important piece, because a livelihood often is thought of like, well, that's my job. That's what I do as employment. But that's not what Sustainable Livelihoods framework focuses on. It's more than a job. It's about being able to maintain. It's how you maintain your economic security and your social involvement. So that may be a main component of how you're maintaining your economic security, may be a job, but it is also for individuals, say on ODSP or in retirement. There's other ways to maintain their economic security and their social involvement. They still have livelihoods, even though they don't have paid employment. So this is a really important aspect to focus on, and just aspect to distinguish. And that livelihood should be sustainable. And you do that by getting a holistic set of assets, not just a job, not just a check or whatever it is. It's not just about money. You need a holistic set of assets to be able to make that livelihood sustainable in the face of life's challenges, stresses, or crises. This is really important. And through those youth employment programs we worked with, before some of their projects even began, they sent to address this unsustainableness of some of what was happening out there. And they would talk to employment programs and agencies in Hamilton serving youth, and find often what was happening is programs were able to get youth jobs and help them keep jobs for however long they were able to support them, 3 or 6 months. But quite often, relatively shortly, or sometimes even immediately when it came to wage subsidies, youth would lose those jobs really quickly after that support went away. So that outcome, even though they're meeting the targets government were funding them for, were not sustainable. And youth would then end up in a different employment program or with a different agency, get a job, lose the job as soon as the support goes away or pretty quickly after, and the cycle continues. So they're in this cycle of needing support, getting a job, but none of those outcomes were ever sustainable, and they kept going through this cycle. So Sustainable Livelihoods focuses on not just getting the job, but getting the assets that are needed so that those outcomes are going to be sustainable. And we recognize that we need to focus, the framework recognizes that we need to focus efforts on a multitude of levels that make people vulnerable, that could be a source of what often called a shock or a crisis or life's challenges. These happen across levels. They can happen at the level of society, for instance, systemic racism, community or workforce. So there might be poor quality jobs, and with youth employment, this is certainly a factor. Like common terms of like MIC jobs, the kinds of jobs that youth are often able to get with little experience and training are not great. They come with their problems, and loss of business. So again, COVID is put a lot of people out of the jobs they used to have, and these shocks could come from the family level. There might be relationship crises, deaths in the family, or negative influences from family members. And it's not just about those external systems, it's also what's going on with the individual, both things the individual has control over and maybe not. So you could have a health crisis that you're doing what you're supposed to do to be healthy, but you can still have a health crisis. Or maybe there's an individual has some qualities that could cause a crisis in their life. Maybe they have anger management issues or poor self-control issues or things like that could be addressed to reduce that individual's vulnerability. Now, this is really important looking across these. The framework says if we really want to reduce vulnerability, if we really want to help people have sustainable livelihoods in our communities, we're going to need a multi-focus, as we sort of talked above, like those multi-service organizations, and we need to work in a collective impact frame in our community. This making a sustainable livelihood doesn't happen from one program or one organization. Quite frequently, it's going to take a multitude of programs and agencies and supports working together in coordination to help create an environment and individuals that have sustainable livelihoods. So the other key feature here is the livelihood assets, this holistic set of assets that people need that's going to help them deal with those shocks or crises if they come along. What is on the screen for you now is a set of assets, how they were defined from Sustainable Livelihoods Canada. We've used in some of the evaluation work we've done, but you know, there's the fine print in there, which might be hard for you to read, but it's not important because these can be adapted to your context, your program context. The key is that you understand there's the holistic set of assets in many different areas. These are just instances, basic needs. People need basic needs as assets, housing, food, shelter, so on. They need supportive social connections. Socially isolation is not good. We need other people to be able to be there and help us and support us and care for us. We need good physical and mental health. We need skills and employability qualities. We need things like sense of self. Here, in this instance, we put self-confidence, ability to advocate for themselves, a sense of hope or direction, spirituality can fit in here, and money. Again, these can be adapted. When we mentioned Indigenous worldviews, so if you're working with Indigenous communities, this might look something more like a medicine wheel and be defined slightly different for those initiatives. The key is to make sure that you're paying attention to a holistic set of assets and that these assets affect each other. Having more of one asset, for instance, basic needs, is going to improve the other assets. So health, your social connections can help with your mental health, can help with getting jobs, so on and so forth. All of these connections are mutually supportive, or if you're really low in one area, that could be the source of threat or shock that's going to cause the other areas to deplete and for you not to have a sustainable livelihood. So they're mutually supportive and the path isn't completely linear. We'll get to a little bit more on that. The other key piece is there's livelihood stages. So people start off at the lowly, either stabilizing or destabilized. So sometimes, like if you're born in your youth, maybe not here, but eventually, like sometimes we recognize that people, when they have a shock in their life, they end up in this destabilized or sort of they're in this effort to stabilize themselves. And this is characterized by having very little assets across those domains, experiencing cycles of crises. So there's multiple things that are finding challenges or producing challenges for individuals that they're trying to deal with. And so individuals are focused on just maintaining their basic needs, getting by month to month and ensuring their basic needs are met and trying to cope, just trying to get by. So this is sort of when you're in that destabilized state. But hopefully you're able to get by well enough that you're able to start ready to connect with the community, ready to start thinking about how to move forward, and start to connect and start to try to build assets, and where we can get into stage 3, where you have enough of a base of stability that you're able to start connecting and building your employability skills. You still need supports from probably other organizations, they're not people in this stage are not quite self-sufficient yet, but they're starting to build skills that are going to get them there. Transition is maybe now you have employment, you're changing patterns and solidifying those change in patterns in your life. And when you start to get to consolidation, I see this almost as like you now have like savings, and that might be in all the different assets. Like there's financial savings, but you have another, like we have a good base of like in the bank, so supportive social connections. Good, the bank, all the basic needs are met. We got some financial savings. I have lots of skills. So we're consolidating those economic solutions and decreasing our vulnerability so that, we'll achieve a sustainable livelihood. So when a shock happens or a crisis happens, we can lean on all those assets. We can lean on our social connections. We can lean on our physical and strong mental health to get us through that crisis, either continuously not lose that livelihood or bounce back really quickly. Important here is that it recognizes change is not linear. You see the dotted line that's moving back. It's a common experience. And when we looked at youth employment, youth transitioning in their careers, that's not a linear process. It's characterized by lots of trial and error, in the very least, even outside of if you're experiencing any kind of crises or major life challenges. There's a lot of, I think this is the direction I want to go with myself and career, testing out a job and realizing this is not the job I want. I now need to go in another direction. I would be surprised if many people in their career path haven't experienced a change of direction and maybe needing to take a step back, retrain, and achieve something else. So a lot of youth have this where they're going in and out of stages 2 to 4, back and forth before they finally figure it out. And the conditions for participation are another really key feature here, is that if you're in sort of like this destabilized state, you're experiencing cycles of crises, you're lacking your basic needs and you need to concentrate on trying to meet them. And you have a depleted assets on mental health or relationships. This makes it really hard to engage in structured programming, structured employment. You don't have that structure in your life, it's hard to engage in structured things. So in these instances, it's really important to focus on building those, what we call those conditions for participation, building that base of stability in people's lives. And lastly, there's the survival versus future mode. Again, this is around when you're just trying to get by month to month, you're focused on survival and coping. You're not focused on building up your assets and planning for your future. And we found that with youth employment. One of the organizations, Liberty for Youth, that I worked with, helps individuals, and we're helping individuals that came out of detention centers or jail. So they're focused on reestablishing their basic needs in their life. So when Liberty for Youth's program had, as step 1, let's do career exploration and career planning and figuring out what kind of career you want. These youth were not very interested. They were like, I want a job and I want a job now. I don't want to spend a couple months exploring options, because these youth needed money. They needed to meet their basic needs, and they needed to meet their basic needs now. So it really shifted the focus of the process and what they were working with youth, when and how, through that program. So those are the big key concepts through the Sustainable Livelihoods framework that guides program design, and we'll get into some of that implications of how it can guide program design, and also how we've used it to guide evaluation of these efforts. But I think I'd pause now and see if anyone has any questions about the framework or any comments on how it resonates with your work. So I think you can use the chat or the Q&A to see if you have any questions or comments at this stage. Just pause for a few more seconds. If we don't see anything, then we'll move on. Okay, great. Feel free to continue to add any questions along the way into the Q&A and the chat, and Kirsten will be monitoring that as we go. So as I mentioned, we'll get into some of the implications of all this framework for designing and some of the lessons that we're drawing from the work with the youth employment programs. This is the exact ones that we worked with were Liberty for Youth and the Youth Can Collective, which is led by Center 3 in Hamilton. So both of them, these are Hamilton-based projects. I mentioned Liberty for Youth was working with males that were coming out of detention centers. They had been in conflict with the law. And the Youth Can focus, these are the group that found there was problems with job retention after working with youth employment programs or agencies. So this program specifically was focused on trying to make those jobs that you've got sustainable. They were focused on helping youth with job retention. Originally, we were talking about job retention, and we we're started more now is talking about sustainable livelihoods as these projects developed. And a key thing that we began to learn and observe were youth lives are basically they're complex adaptive systems. So not all youth's lives, but when they're in that red zone, in that livelihood stage diagram, I'll quickly go back there. So you can see where there's the blue and where there's the red. So while we're more in the red, their youth's lives, and this can apply to other individuals as well, that other adults, it doesn't have to be youth, it can be anybody, it can be seniors, but when they're in that destabilized or even anywhere in that red zone, their lives tend to be more like what we describe in systems thinking and complexity concepts as complex adaptive systems. So this is a context where there's multiple independent but related factors that are affecting results or their people's assets, and we see that there's these people are dealing with multiple barriers to employment. It's not just one thing that is their issue, that they don't need to focus on just improving one outcome area in their life and everything's solved. That might be what's needed down the line, but in their context, they're dealing with multiple things, and things are developing in non-linear ways. As we mentioned, sometimes there's steps forward, then there's steps back, and we have to replan and readjust, or you solve one problem, and which is the priority for youth or an individual that day or that week. And then next month, there's a new crisis or a different crisis that now needs to be addressed. And this isn't happening in a predictable way that you're able to, there's a lot of things going on in their lives that you can't predict and be like, okay, so in month 2, this is going to happen in their life, and therefore we're going to be doing this in month 2. So, and we talked about that collective impact framework. You need a multitude of agencies working together, and it could be that it's not you have 5 agencies working together, so they each take I think that's 20% of the results of the outcome. It doesn't, the math doesn't quite work that way. You could have you could minus one agency and you don't have 80% impact. You could have zero impact because that's a source of crisis where everything falls apart. So the outcomes don't just equal the sum of the parts in these complex adaptive systems. And that's really speaks true to the youth employment experience with a lot of the clients that we're working with. And so here's a situational assessment framework. This comes from Dave Stonen's ConnectED framework, is the diagram on the slide here. This shows that, this is talking about there's different contexts. And when we're in a context of where things are obvious, often in other frameworks, it's called a simple or complicated contexts. And I'm not going to go into too much details. You can look it more up. But when we're in these more simple and ordered contexts where there is a bit more linearity and a bit more predictability, programs work great. And programs are things that are a set of rules. You have a program plan, and we are going to we're going to follow these rules for what we do with every participant that comes into our program. And we're going to try to do it the exact same way each time. And there's probably a start and an end date with that program for individuals that are in it. So programs are based on a set of rules that say, do this every time. You can create a fidelity checklist to say, are you doing the program the way you should be doing the program? That sort of thing. And this is how we traditionally try to solve social problems. This is traditionally where funders fund. They fund programs. That seems to work well in simple or complicated contexts. But when we're in complex or even chaotic, that doesn't work so well anymore. Things are constantly changing. Things are constantly adapting in more unpredictable ways in those contexts, in those individuals' lives. So coming with a predetermined plan of what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and you must stick to that, can be really ineffective. And we can see this plainly in COVID today. We can't be running programs the same way today as we were running them before COVID. And the COVID situation keeps changing and adapting, and nonprofits have to keep changing and adapting how they work with their clients within there, because COVID really has made pretty much everything into a complex situation where everything's changing and adapting. We're learning as we go. And so when we're in that situation, what's more effective, rather than trying to give a program, is giving principles focused supports or principles focused initiative. That's what's going to work well. And to sort of give you a bit more understanding of what principles-based support looks like versus a program support that's based on rules. I'm going to define, the difference between rules and what's Michael Companion's work on principles-focused evaluation. What are effectiveness principles? So rules say take the same action always. We see this a lot with some of the religious rules of thou shalt not, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal. You're never supposed to do that. It doesn't matter what the context is. It doesn't matter if it's self-defense. It doesn't matter if you're hungry and your family needs, and your family's hungry or whatever. You're just don't do it. It's against the religion. So context doesn't matter. You're not supposed to do it. You're always supposed to follow that rule. Always. Same thing with maybe following a recipe. Just follow these steps. It's kind of recipes like a program for making a cake or a program for whatever dish you're looking for. Here's the set of rules and the set of steps that you're supposed to follow each time to make that thing. Where principles provide context-sensitive guidance on how to act to achieve your desired result. So you're going to consistently follow that advice, but what you do is going to be dependent on the context you're within each time. So a good example is the golden or platinum rule. And I like the platinum, which is do unto others as they would like you to do unto them, not as you would like done unto you. So you're thinking about other people, not just yourself the whole time. So in that case, each time you're following that advice, but you have to assess the situation. Who is that other individual? What are their preferences? That's going to guide me to act in different ways each time, but I'm following the same principle consistently. Contrasting with the recipe, a rule, a effectiveness principle would be guide a seasoned taste. Again, who are the individuals I'm cooking for? Do they like spicy? Do they like salty? What's the context? What's the situation? Is this date night? Or is it a celebrational meal? That's going to influence the kinds of food or how I'm going to cook versus versus if it's just a regular day. So these are ways that in contexts that are complex and things are changing in unpredictable ways, and you can't just do what you did yesterday today. These effectiveness principles, because they're context dependent and flexible, they're going to be useful throughout the whole time. They should be, if they're good principles, be useful to you in that changing circumstance. So with the youth employment programs, what I have on the screen is the principles that they guided to eventually guide their work. Now, both these organizations started out with a program mindset. For 3D, it was discovery. 3D standard for discovery, development, deployment. They thought, okay, we'll do career planning in the first 6 months, then we'll get people test out and volunteer and co-ops, job experience in the next one, and then we'll get them jobs in the final 6 months. So very structured, very planned out what they were going to do. And as we said, they learned that this isn't really working. Our schedule on our timelines, on our plan isn't working with these youth's lives. And similarly, we realized this, that like the multitude of things that youth were dealing with and things when we talked to employment agencies through the post-employment program as well. So the post-employment, we started seeing the applicability of the Sustainable Livelihoods framework, and they developed these guiding principles to be able to provide flexible and individualized supports. So with each youth that came into them, they would do an assessment and they would explore the asset areas with the youth and collaboratively decide on, well, what is it that you need to focus on? So it wasn't just about jobs. And they did have, for those that needed it, an occupational therapist that could provide things like mental well-being supports around dealing with anxieties and dealing with stress. So some of these youth, that was kind of the issues. They were working mixed jobs, but they had anxiety challenges, anxiety issues, which those two things did not work well together. So, but it was up to the youth and the job coach collaboratively to decide on what was the priority to be worked on. And then they would do it together. So each client got a different set of supports on a different set of schedule. They communicated with job coaches based on their preferences. Big surprise for me, I should have saw it coming, but I was not used to a program that primarily communicated with their clients through text. But this happened a lot with some of the youth. And then some of the youth needed to see an occupational therapist, and that was a schedule, like once a week or twice a week. But others, it was as needed. The program would check in with them every now and again. So some youth got many, that really needed it, would call in frequently and had many instances of support, where other youth were they just needed a few times with the job coaches, and they were good and they were set. So it was really dependent. Even the amount of services that people got was individualized, depending on each person's needs. So that's how it sort of influenced their programming and how they ended up providing principles-based support rather than a program model of support. Going in, like, how did this influence evaluation, and how do I think, even learning from some of the lessons of doing those evaluations, how evaluation of sustainable livelihoods focused programming should look like. So sustainable livelihoods provides a common theory of change, and that's great if you're using it. That means you're not starting from zero. You have an understanding of how people progress towards a sustainable livelihood and how you need to support them in doing that. But you still need to know, what works best for our clients, our particular clients, and within our particular community, in our particular context today. And what are those guiding principles that we can follow that's going to help us be effective throughout those different contexts and different people that we're serving? So we can do that by, again, focusing on the assets and not the outcome of just getting jobs, focusing on those holistic set of assets. And we can create tools that are useful not just for an evaluator or a program manager or a funder, but useful for those that are actually filling it out and collecting the data. So frontline staff and the participant, the clients themselves, the youth themselves, is what we did in some of these instances. And my colleagues at Sustainable Livelihoods Canada focuses on, helping a community of practice learn how to do sustainable livelihoods coaching. Within that, they create, we have like livelihoods journey mapping. Here's an example, and that is useful for getting clients to learn about sustainable livelihoods and their path, their assets, get them to describe what it is, assets they do have, what assets they're missing, and what is their priorities for moving forward. And you can do this again later on and get them to reflect back now that they have a common understanding, to be like, where were you then? Where are you now? And then getting them to describe, give you a story just in rich qualitative detail on their progress that they've made since joining your program related to those asset areas. And you can, how did the program contribute to that change? So you get that rich qualitative information, but then you can collect stories. I mean, you can ask close-ended questions, so you get quantitative data around those questions, those evaluation questions of like, well, what works well for whom, under what conditions? We can create some theories, some guesses, and then create questions to test those out. Or what is the effectiveness principles? Were those in place when there's good progress, or were they in place when there's not good progress? We'll create those closed-ended questions to test those things out, get the clients to answer those related to their stories. So the clients are doing that qualitative coding themselves, which saves a lot of time for the evaluation. You can then, visualize the patterns. So you can look, here's a showing where the clients that made progress versus the clients that didn't make progress. Well, let's compare that to the questions around our theories around what worked well for whom, and around what is the effectiveness principles. We would like to see that when there isn't progress, maybe the effectiveness principles weren't really there. And when there is progress, the effectiveness, following the effectiveness principles did happen. So we can then provide support for, yes, doing the work in these ways is the right way to do. It leads to the results we want to see. And you can bring those patterns back to your clients, and the staff working with them can work one-on-one to review well, here's the story, here's what you're said about what is working and what is not working. Let's discuss this. How does this change how we work with you, what we're focusing on as outcomes with you, and what do we need to do next? So you can use that for program planning with the clients, which makes it useful both for staff and clients. And then at a program level or at a collective impact level across organizations, we can review this data to learn about what worked well for whom and effectiveness principles that lead to better supporting sustainable livelihoods in your community. So the benefits of this is, common framework can help quantify impact in a general way, but also in a culturally relevant way. It's the clients that are coding their own stories. And so they're saying what's meaningful for them. And if you involve them in creating the closed-ended questions and involve them in making sense of the patterns, then we're doing this evaluation work in a way that's going to be culturally meaningful and relevant to the people you serve. Because they're coding it, it eases up analysis, it eases up reporting requirements and effort. And then if many organizations are using this common framework, you're not recreating the wheel each time. Each organization doesn't have to recreate the wheel. Saves a lot of financial time and costs. If we have more stories, going to be better able to detect patterns within them. And different organizations can benchmark and learn from their peers. So there's a huge benefit for many people adopting this similar framework. So that is it for me. I hope you found that useful and engaging. And yeah, I'd love to hear if you think about what you think so far about the Sustainable Livelihoods framework, or any questions you have, or challenges or opportunities in using this in the work that you do. Because with a small group, are we able to unmute people?
Yes, we can definitely unmute folks. If you'd like to speak to your own organization's experience or the context, I can definitely unmute you, and you'll be able to essentially be able to chat with us as well. But I'm seeing a comment in the chat from Cheryl, thanks. I can see the importance of when providing a program such as the Infant Food Bank, that a collective impact approach is essential, as we may be just hitting a few of the livelihood assets, such as basic needs and social connections, but by connecting individually with each family, we can determine their other needs and refer or link them to other agencies who can help with meeting other required assets. That's great.
Yeah, for sure. If you're using this, you can use this framework to explore, well, maybe we're not serving those other assets, but it's important for us to explore what else you need and making sure you have it, even if it's just by referring you to other things. Doing that work will help ensure that the work you do has sustainable impact.
I have a question myself, actually, Paul, that I'm not sure if you can speak to, but I'm curious. Regarding funding applications or report backs, have you seen or heard the Sustainable Livelihoods framework used in the kind of reporting context or planning sort of context, and heard any feedback from potentially more strict funders who want to know specifics about how an agency will be doing something or won't, or have done something, and if the Sustainable Livelihoods framework, in the fluid methodology that it kind of promotes and encourages, if that has been a challenge or a real positive for folks who have used the Sustainable Livelihood or referred to the Sustainable Livelihoods framework with funders or other experts.
Yeah, and I'll admit, like, so like the principles-based approach to this is, I think, something that I've added to it through my work with the youth employment programs, seeing that, you know, that I think before, where it shifted things was, okay, it's not just about getting the job. Now the outcomes we have to focus on are also improving assets in other areas. But there would still have been, well, tell us what those assets are and how much you're going to improve those assets. Tell us the outcomes ahead of time, types ways. I have talked to, like, I think so, Kristen, I mentioned that I had given a presentation to United Way Greater Toronto in their Career Navigator program. So they're realizing the same lessons that I was realizing separately at the same time around the flexibility in things. So they're updating their evaluation framework to be more flexible as well, even though they didn't use sustainable livelihoods at the time to guide their evaluation framework. They realized we need to make it more flexible. We need to say, some programs might be looking at some outcomes, but some others might not be looking at other outcomes. So they're learning that, like, providing service in a more flexible way is important. So they were very much intrigued by the sustainable livelihoods framework and saw how it was applicable in this principles focused way, even though they haven't as of yet like adapted anything, because they sort of just created before I shared their framework. But I mean, they found it quite applicable to the work that they're doing.
That's great. Thank you. Anybody have any questions, perhaps in regards to your own specific work or context with the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework and principles-based evaluation and design in mind? I will leave it open just for a few more minutes, and then and I will move over to our thank you slide, essentially. And actually, first, I will share in the chat now something from earlier regarding the Mohawk Village Park. And so if anybody has any, oh, I apologize, I just sent the other one. Oh, Diana has a question. I hope I'm saying your name right. Can you go into some detail about how you formulate your closed-ended questions for evaluation with regards to, if I'm understanding, with regards to the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework?
Yeah, so with that framework, I would, get together with the stakeholders, and that being one of the ones being the clients, but also the staff that are delivering the programs, management, partners, as we talked about, often needing to work in a collective impact framework, and discuss, what's your theory? What is your ideas about what works well for whom, under what context? What are the effectiveness principles that are going to help you be effective? And start coming up with drafts, and these could be best guesses at the time, but this is why then we can then start to create questions that can test them out. So I think on the slide, how do I go back? Quick example. So the one question on this slide, and if I can start from the beginning, didn't it? It's swap. There we go. So the question at the bottom would test out like this. Their effectiveness principle was, the coach and the youth collaboratively decided on what were going to be the goals to work towards. So here's a question that would, on a scale from 1 to 5 kind of thing, and creating a rubric on like how much was it the coach? Did the youth say, I think I want to go back to school? And the coach said, no, how are you going to pay your bills? And that kind of this is a kind of example of the kind of thing that would often happen. Where did that land? How did that, because sometimes the coach is like, well, that's a really not good idea, but I can't just say, no, I'm putting my foot down. You need to have buy-in. They have to, there's the other sustainable livelihoods coaching thing uses motivational interviewing. Like they have to have their motivations for change. So it can't just be driven by the job coach, but there is sometimes still where they're coaching and it might have some influence on maybe you should go in one direction versus the other. So this is their effectiveness principle. So how often do those things happen in practice? And you would like to see where maybe a pattern where youth that aren't making the progress in their sustainable livelihoods over time, maybe it's because of that wasn't happening. Maybe it was the youth was saying, I decided, the job coach said some stuff and I completely ignored it and did what I wanted to do. And then we're seeing, well, the youth that tend to do that tend not to progress in their sustainable livelihoods journey as much. So that would confirm that effectiveness principle.
Awesome. Thank you for speaking to that question, Paul, and Diana for speaking to it or to posing that question. I'm going to override your shared screen, Paul, and essentially say a very quick and very big thank you to those who are attending, who have posed questions or otherwise, and to Paul, of course, for facilitating today and sharing this information. I think that it is great to hear that evaluative measures are taking into account more than just a single sort of program outcome or output, and how we can collectively move towards those kinds of holistic, asset-based, and very human-centered program designs and evaluation metrics is really exciting. And so really, really big thank you to Paul for facilitating today. We will follow up shortly with everybody for a feedback survey, as well as the presentation slide deck. And the recording of today's session will be shared at a later date. Included in that feedback survey will be a link or some information and a question regarding getting more in touch with Paul himself and with the Social Impact Squared organization. And so if you would like to learn more about them, you are welcome to explore their website and also subscribe to their newsletter, and some more information about that will be in the follow-up. And that link in the chat that Paul just threw in there is the subscription for the newsletter. With that, and it being 12 o'clock, thank you again with everybody. Thank you, Kimberly, and everybody for your feedback. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me directly afterwards. And on that note, I hope everybody has a very restful stat holiday if you are able to take that day, and take care. Thank you again so much for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Take care. Bye.